Today, we're diving into what's basically the ultimate study guide for one of the most intense, confusing, and honestly, incredible parts of life: adolescence. We're going to explore that wild journey of figuring out who you are, giving you a clear roadmap to understand what's really going on. It sounds like such a simple question, doesn't it? Who are you? But the answer is, well, it's anything but simple. And for most of us, that question starts to get really, really loud during our teenage years. It kind of becomes the central mission. Figuring out who you are right now and maybe even more importantly, who you're on your way to becoming. All right, let's open up this guide. Here's our game plan. First, we'll tackle the whole idea of the changing self. Then, we'll get into the great identity search. After that, we're going to look at how we build our own moral compass. And finally, we'll explore the super complex social world of a teenager. Let's dive in. So, Chapter 1, Who Am I Becoming? This is all about what's happening on the inside, that evolving sense of self. How does the way a teenager sees themselves actually shift and change as they get older? It's a pretty wild progression when you lay it out. In early adolescence, you can hold two totally opposite ideas about yourself, like I'm shy and I'm outgoing, and it doesn't really bother you. But then you hit middle adolescence, and suddenly those contradictions start to feel like a real conflict. And this is when what your friends think becomes huge. Then, finally, in late adolescence, things start to click into place. A more coherent, integrated self begins to form, and with it, self-esteem usually gets a nice little boost. So what actually fuels that self-esteem? Well, our guide points to three really big things. First, being good at stuff that you actually care about. Not what someone else thinks is cool, but what's important to you. Second, getting that nod of approval from the people who really matter in your life. And third, and this one is so important, is something called authoritative parenting. Now, don't mix this up with authoritarian parenting, which is all about being strict. Authoritative is the sweet spot. Parents are warm, they're involved, they set clear rules, but they're also willing to talk about them. That mix is just a fantastic foundation for self-worth. Okay, on to Chapter 2. So if the first part was about how our sense of self just kind of changes, this part is about the active search. This is when you start consciously trying to find your place in the world. It's the great identity search. The famous psychologist Erik Erikson basically said this is the main event of being a teenager. He called it the battle between finding a solid identity versus feeling lost in role confusion. Put simply, the job is to take all the different pieces of you, your personality, your beliefs, your hopes for the future, and weave them all together into one coherent story. So how in the world do you build that story? Well, the first key ingredient you need is exploration. Seriously, think of it like trying on a bunch of different hats. You experiment with different hobbies, different friend groups, different ideas, just to see what feels right, what actually fits you. And of course, the second ingredient is commitment. This is the part where after you've done all that exploring, you land on something. You make a choice about your values or a career path or what you believe, and you decide, yeah, this is me. So what happens when you mix those two ingredients, exploration and commitment, in different amounts? Well, a psychologist named James Marcia came up with a really powerful way to map out the whole identity search. Let's break it down. Okay, this chart makes it super clear. If you've done a lot of exploring and you've made a firm commitment, boom, you've hit identity achievement. Now, if you're exploring like crazy but you just haven't landed on anything yet, that's called moratorium. You can think of it as a totally healthy gap year for your identity. On the flip side, you've got foreclosure. That's when you're committed, but you didn't really explore. Like maybe you just decided to follow your parents' path without questioning it. And last, there's diffusion, where you're not really exploring or committed. And here is exactly why this all matters so much. This isn't just some abstract theory from a textbook. Research consistently shows that people who reach that identity achievement status tend to have better mental health, more stable relationships, and more satisfying careers. So yeah, this journey has a pretty important destination. All right, time for Chapter 3. While we're busy figuring out who we are, we also have to figure out what we stand for. It's time to talk about developing a personal code, about calibrating that moral compass. To get at this, psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg used tricky moral dilemmas, and this one is his most famous. It's called the Heinz dilemma. You've got a guy, Heinz, whose wife is dying. There's a drug that can save her, but the pharmacist is charging a fortune for it, way more than Heinz can afford. He's desperate. So, what should he do? Should he steal the drug? Here's the brilliant part. Kohlberg didn't actually care if you said yes or no. He was interested in the why. The reasoning you gave for your answer is what revealed your stage of moral development. Kohlberg discovered that our reasoning tends to move through three main levels. At the first level, pre-conventional, it's all about direct consequences. A little kid might say, Heinz shouldn't steal because he'll go to jail. Simple punishment and reward. Then there's the conventional level, which is all about maintaining social order. Stealing is against the law, so he shouldn't do it. But at the highest level, post-conventional, your reasoning gets more abstract. You might say something like, a human life is fundamentally more valuable than a law protecting property. You're operating from your own personal ethical principles. Now, it's a hugely important theory, but it's not without its critics. Some people point out that it's very focused on a Western idea of justice and doesn't really account for values like compassion. Others argue that just because you can reason at a high level doesn't mean you'll actually act that way. Still, it's a foundational way to think about how our sense of right and wrong grows up. And for our final chapter, let's shift our focus from the inner world to the outer one. Let's talk about navigating your social world. Because the entire landscape of your relationships with family and friends totally transforms during these years. Take a look at this graph. It tells a really clear story. As kids go from elementary school through high school, the amount of time they actually spend with their family takes a pretty steady dive. And you know what? This is a completely normal and necessary part of becoming your own person. And as that independence grows, well, so does the friction. This graph shows that conflict with parents, especially with moms, tends to spike right around 15 or 16 years old. It can definitely be a stressful time, but it's usually over small everyday stuff, and it's a normal part of figuring out a new, more adult relationship with your parents. Hey, remember we talked about parenting styles earlier? This chart just hammers the point home. You see, a few different styles are pretty common, but the data is just crystal clear that authoritative style, the one with both warmth and clear boundaries, is consistently linked with the best outcomes for teens across the board. So what about the world of friends? It's basically organized into two main types of groups. First, you've got your clique. That's your small, tight-knit crew, the people you actually hang out with. But then you have crowds. These are the bigger reputation-based labels, like the jocks, the brains, or the theater kids. You can be part of a crowd without even knowing everyone in it. It's just how the social map of the school is drawn. And within those friendships, studies often show some general patterns. On average, girls' friendships tend to be more focused on emotional intimacy and mutual support. By contrast, boys' friendships are often more centered around doing things together, shared activities, a bit of friendly competition. But of course, these are just general tendencies, not strict rules for anyone. And that brings us to one last big question to chew on. We talk about adolescence as the time for finding yourself. But a lot of psychologists now talk about a whole new stage called emerging adulthood. That stretch from about 19 to 25 as another huge period of exploration. Which leaves us with a final thought. Is the search for who we are something we ever really finish? Or is it simply the journey of a lifetime?